and welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be reviewing a Luban No. 4 handplane. Hope you enjoy. So straight off I want to say that if it wasn't for my patrons I wouldn't have been able to afford this Luban to review it. So big thanks out there to my patrons that have slowly been supporting me in the background, and if you want to support me so I can buy tools like this to review them, please consider checking out Patreon. So what we're going to do today is just unbox this. I'm going to take a look at it, clean any of the oil off it that stops it rusting and any packaging, and then we'll see how it performs straight out of the box. So let's jump down here and we'll get started. I have a very basic packaging here, just a straight non-coloured cardboard, and we can see that their logo here seems to be authenticity and humanity. So if we look at the rest here, we can see it's just a label from the place I purchased it, the repeat of the top on the side here, and then on this side and the reverse side over here we have No. 4, and then they've got a couple of ticks here, so ductile iron base and frog, stainless steel cap, lever cap, lightly finished wooden handle, high carbon tool steel 25-degree blade and angle that is at 1/8 of an inch thick, I'm guessing, and tool requires minimal tune-up prior to use. So let's go with the unboxing. So you can just see that it's just a standard open box here, and the packaging in here is a little bit of bubble wrap to stop it knocking around in the box and obviously getting damaged during transport. That's all there is there. So we can see that this hand plane is sealed in a plastic bag here. And if we look here, we can see that it's actually stuck, so we can see that there's actually a light machine oil in here as well, which we'll have to clean off. Let's go ahead and we'll cut this bag open. Now, one thing off the bat, I can see it said stainless steel lever cap, but this looks like it's a brass lever cap or a brass coated lever cap, and that might be the only difference, because I did know there was varieties of that available, but I didn't realize that's what I actually purchased here. So just know there are versions that have a different lever cap. So we can see there's this layer of oil here. So what we're going to do first before we check this over is I'm actually just going to disassemble this, and we'll just clean some of this oil off so we can get to using the plane. So it's good to see straight out of the box that it has some means of preventing it from rusting. And so we're just going to go ahead, wipe that off the sole because that's the most noticeable spot. And now I can see it's also on the blade. So what we're going to do is just quickly take this apart. But we're going to come in here and just undo this. Just wipe all of this oil off. And so there's a good coating of light machine oil in here to stop this from rusting, and I can't see a spot of rust anywhere on here, which is fantastic. So let's just quickly put this back together. I will not take the frog out at this stage, but I'm sure there's a little bit of machine oil underneath, but we will take a very close look at that later on. So now we've cleaned the oil off, I'm going to do a few checks. We'll see how square everything is and what the machining looks like and things like that to start with, but we will do an initial setup in the next video, so stay tuned for that when that comes out. If we look at this, the finish it's not too bad. A couple of little indiscrepancies just on the bottom of the plane here and on these very few edges, a little bit of chipping, which is not fantastic, but if we go through an initial flattening process, that will be removed, so it's not a big deal. We can see that it is actually missing a little bit of paint on the back corner here, which is not great, and just on the back corner here. So although the fit and finish feels good on this so far, the packaging I think has let it down a little bit and has abraded a little bit of the paint off in a few spots, which obviously it's not a very expensive plane. Now I do want to say that I purchased this for $190. It had 20% off. It was back around Christmas time that I got it, and it's actually a really good price for something like this. it is still a little bit of a pity that we are missing a little bit of paint here and there, which is not the most fantastic, but at that price point, it's probably expected. Having said that, the brand new Stanley Bailey that I got wasn't actually missing any of that, and its packaging was about the same as this, so you can take what you will from that. Handles feel like they have a bit of a lacquer finish on them. They said lightly coated. I was expecting them to be oiled, but there's definitely a bit of a film finish on it. It definitely feels like a film finish. And in actual fact, if we get the light in the right spot right on this handle, I don't know if you can see it, but you can actually see a little bit of the film finish here. So my guess is that it's some sort of a lacquer that's been sprayed on out of a spray can, and I don't really like that type of finish on a handle for me. A shellac doesn't have that same sort of plastic feel, in my opinion. But you know, it's not a bad finish, and these handles are probably not going to discolor and dry out with that on there, so it'll be a well-wearing, good durable finish. So I think that's positive. So let's have a quick look at the lever cap here. Now it looks like this entire lever cap is actually out of brass. I was expecting it to be the stainless steel variety, so maybe there was a mix-up at the store, because I do know there are different varieties when it comes to these Luban hand planes. But we can see it seems to be a fairly standard sort of finish. There's no rocking in here, and it feels like it's a nice tight lever cap, which seems to be nicely polished to sort of that satin sort of finish, and nicely flattened along the edge here by the looks of it, so it makes a nice even pressure along this edge from the spring up here when we actually hold the blade assembly in place. Now we look at the blade assembly. Still a little bit of oil on this, so we can see that it's a nicely machined 25-degree angle, which we will check in a minute. We can see that the cap iron or the chip breaker here actually has quite heavy machining, and that would be something that I'd correct. It may still be functional, but I'd like that to be a nice smooth and not heavy machining lines on here. So we'll see how well this works without doing anything to it straight out of the box. But my preference would be that this should have been the sort of finish that's on the blade just here. That would be something that if the makers of Luban are out there listening, machine that angle on the chip breaker a little bit smoother, just like the bevel on the blade, and I think this would be fantastic. Other than that, the fit and finish is nice. It's the thicker styling of blade that we're becoming accustomed to these days, and they work well. I've used one of the Luban blades before, and you can check that link out below for that one. So I know these work well, and we'll see how well they go. They will need, like all these sort of blades, a few of these sharp corners smoothed out, and just turning it into your own, a little bit of fettling, but that's nothing much. It's just taking the very sharp corners off them, because they are very sharp. Now we come down and we look at the frog. We can see it's just a very, very basic bent lateral adjuster, and I think it'll still work fairly well as long as this sits nice and tight on the blade. So let's drop this in here, and there's barely any sideways movement on that lateral adjuster, which means that it's fairly well fit. There is ever so slightly, but we can see when I adjust it, as soon as I start moving it, it adjusts it. So it's machined with tolerances that allow it to operate straight away with no sort of backlash within it. The machining on the frog here is a very smooth machining. There's no rough groove marks, and when we come to initiate this, we will check to see how flat this is, but I will put a straight edge on it so we can check today. And it once again has a brass screw here for the lever cap. One thing I didn't mention is that this is not the Stanley Bailey pattern, it is the bedrock pattern. And if you ever get a plane that has these flat edges versus these rounded style, that's generally the difference between the Bailey pattern and the bedrock pattern has this flat top. Now, when we look down inside here, the other thing we can see is these are not screws. There's no screw slots on them, and that is another key indicator that it's a bedrock pattern. And if we look round on the back here, we can see there's a screw on that side and a screw on that side, and these go through into these two pins here on a slight angle, and it pulls it down, and that's what locks it in place. And we will take this off in a minute so we can check out the actual machining below this frog. Now I want to take your attention to the depth adjustment screw here. We can see that it moves fairly freely, which is fantastic. It's a little bit of vibration if we throw it a little too fast, but I think that's just the metal on metal. We can see in here that there's practically no backlash in here. It's a very tight machining where the yoke, which comes through onto the top here, is actually into this depth adjustment screw, and so it seems to react almost instantly when we turn it, which means there's very good machining and very good tolerances where this meets the adjuster. And so before we take the frog out, I just wanted to show you how well this blade works in here with the top of the yoke. So we obviously put the blade assembly down in here, and when we turn this depth adjustment knob here, the blade moves in perfect concert with it. There's not a single bit of backlash when we go forward and backward. It moves instantly, and so I wanted to show you why I believe that is. So if we have a really close look at the top of this yoke, we can see it's got a little bulbous piece on the end. It's not actually flat, and so it bulges on the top and the bottom, and that allows complete connection with the slot in the chip breaker here. And so even if it was slightly off, that bulbous part makes connection on the top and the back there, and it takes all backlash out in the actual connection with the blade. And I believe that is why this actually works well. It's a very good engineered design. And so if I actually just show you with the chip breaker, you might get a better idea of what's going on. So when it comes in here, we can see there's literally no slop in that slot, even without the blade there, which is going to sit it out like this a little bit further. It still makes connection, and what happens is the lower part of that bulbous piece here actually grabs the flat part here, and that's why it actually works so well. It's making a positive contact on the hard edge of the slot. So now what I'm going to do is I'll grab a screwdriver and we'll detach this frog, and we can have a look at the machining around that frog. The screws are very tight to start with. That just means nothing's going to move. What I said we'd do is we'd see how flat these are, so let's have a quick look at the tolerances with a straight edge on these, and just to see exactly what's going on with the machining on this. So just before we go ahead and look at that, we're just going to have another quick look down in here, and we can see the machining of the attachment for the frog here. You can see that it's some sort of a milling machine that's come down, and it's in these lines, but although it looks like it's in these ridging here, it actually feels dead flat, and we will check that in a little bit as well. So before we go ahead and just see exactly how flat some of these machine parts are, I thought we'd go ahead, take the handles off and just see how these are attached. So we have our standard brass nut on top of I call it a barrel bolt, because these used to be a complete set of barrels, so it's a nut and bolt that runs on the inside and attaches at the bottom, which I'll show you in a second. It is interesting to see that this is coated in some black coating. My assumption is to prevent rust, which is a really good addition, because if you know anything about the traditional ones and the ones that are just straight steel, they tend to rust badly, especially if you've restored them. Some of you will know that, and so that's a good little touch. This style handle is the one that actually has a separate little screw just down here on the bottom, so let's go ahead and take that out. Nice little attention to detail here is that this is once again a brass screw, or possibly brass plated, I'm not sure. So that's a nice little addition there, because on most of them it's a steel screw. And we can see there's actually no rocking in the bottom of this handle. Sometimes these are not dead flat on the bottom and they rock. This doesn't seem to have any such problems. And we can see the machining here looks quite nice. I'm going to assume that it's sitting there flat, and we can have a quick check of that. It's interesting to see that this is actually painted, because on most of the hand planes the top part here would not be painted. But as long as it sits flat and the handle doesn't move, I don't have a problem with that, because this will help prevent rust under your handle, which is a very common occurrence. That one off, and we can see we have the exact same machining, and instead of a little raised ridge, it's an entire raised flat piece that it references on here. And if we look down in here, this actually has a little washer in there, presumably to stop it digging into the wood too much. Or it might have been put in there as a spacer, which is quite common on older ones. If you have the wood shrink a little spacer of a washer can be put in there. So now what I thought we'd do is we'll take a quick look at the machining. Normally I'm not too worried about exactly how flat it is, as long as it's flat enough, it's flat enough. And to check how flat this is, I do have a feeler gauge here, and I'm going to use the straight edge of my combination square here. I'm just going to take the actual shaft out, and we're going to use that. And so we're going to check and use a couple of feeler gauges, and we'll see what the tolerances are. Now, bear in mind, a lot of these planes, although it said it needs minimal fettling out of the box, a lot of these planes still do need a little bit of flattening in various spots, so we need to bear that in mind. But we want to see the tolerances on this, which seem to be fairly good just from what I've seen so far. The first check I like to do is actually check for light. So if you don't have a feeler gauge, light under a straight edge will give you a good indication as to how flat something is. Because by eye, the light will come through even the teeny tiniest of gaps, like 0.01 of a millimeter. You can actually see light through that. And so it's a good indicator if you don't have a set of feeler gauges. Now, I'm going to use the feeler gauges just so you can see what it is. I can see on this currently that it looks pretty good. There's a tiny, tiny little bit of light seeping through under here, but it's just a fraction of a millimeter. So let's hold this flat on here, and this very first feeler gauge is 0.038 of a millimeter, and we can see it's getting under here ever so slightly, just in the middle. So let me hold this down. Yeah, so just in the middle it manages to sneak under. So let's just creep up to the next size, which is 0.076 millimeters. And that's not sneaking under in the middle here. Which means that our tolerances are within 0.076 of a millimeter. I'm going to say the machining there is very good. Now, if you want it absolutely 100% perfect, you could rub this back and forwards on a fine sharpening stone or something, and that will flatten it out further. But for my liking, that flatness is actually good enough for the operation of this frog, and it's actually a little hollow just in the middle of the frog, and that is probably so the outside edges, which are the most important parts here, actually reference nice and flat and tight where you want them, so the whole thing doesn't rock, so it doesn't have a belly. So it might have purposely had an ever so slight hollow put in the middle, just so that the whole thing does not rock when it's in the plane. And that could be a good thing. I don't know whether that's the case, but it could be the case, and that really doesn't need any attention in my eyes. So now let's look at the face of the frog. Now, holding this up to the light, I actually don't see any gaps under this, so let's get the feeler gauge and we'll start at that most finest feeler again and we'll see what we end up with. Bear in mind with these, because we've got these cutouts, we have to actually reference right on the very edge, and that makes this actually tricky to actually check with a feeler gauge. So back to the finest feeler gauge here. I'm going to hold that as flat as I can and just make sure this is as upright as I can get it. If it's angled, the feeler gauge can get under it. So right along this edge, I can't get the 0.038 of a millimeter or 0.005 of an inch under that, which means on that side the machining's good. So let's just quickly check the other side. I can't get that under there either. One thing I have noticed is there's a couple of little inconsistencies in the machining here. There's a little bit of paint with a little dig just sitting on the surface. It's not affecting the machining. The machining's flat over the top of that, which might be why it was still there. It might have been, it's probably been machined after it was painted, and that's where flat came out right the way through, and so it was left there, but there is a little inconsistency there. Not a big deal. It doesn't seem to affect how flat this is, and I think on the whole the machining here is actually very good. Now when we do the initiation of this, I will be putting this across a diamond plate, so we will see exactly how accurate I have come up here with my testing, and that's going to be an easier way of checking how flat this is versus the feeler gauge, but that gives you a good idea. So now that we know that the bottom of this is fairly flat, what I thought we'd do is to test how flat the bottom of our machining here is on the casting for the frog is. The real test is whether this frog rocks. So if I put it in here, if this is dead flat on both sides, even if it does have a slight hollow in the center, it's machined square on the outsides to hold it, this would rock if there was some inconsistency. So let's have a look at that. So I am putting weight on both sides. It's not rocking, and it won't rock back to front. In actual fact, it doesn't seem to even want to move side to side particularly easy, and that's because I've removed the oil. So you always do like, it's always a good idea to have a little thin layer of oil in between the two to allow them to adjust when you want them to. But obviously the fact that they're not moving and there's actually no rocking when I'm pushing side to side means that I get the tickle approval on the frog attachment on the sole of this as well, just purely because we've checked that this is referencing flat, and if this was not flat, this would rock, and it doesn't. Therefore, we know that that is machined well within the tolerances that are required for a tool such as this. Now, before we go ahead, put it all back together, I just wanted to check how square both wings are to the sole, because if you were planning on using this particular plane, generally a number 4 I wouldn't use on a shooting board, but maybe it's something you might be interested in. So in order to test this properly, the sole should be the flat reference that the wings come off, so we want to put the stock against the bottom, and I know some people do it the other way around, but this is our referencing because this should be the flat area that the plane uses, so that should always be the reference to the wing rather than the other way around. So we'll put the stock on here, we'll come up, and I can see a little bit of light coming in under this, but not much. Let me just quickly grab that feeler gauge. If we look closely here, that feeler gauge is not getting under there, which means that this is actually machined pretty square. Although I can see a tiny bit of light, the light that I can see is smaller than 0.038 of a millimeter. Which means that if we wanted to use this plane those wings are square enough to the sole that we would have no problems whatsoever using this on a shooting board, which is a big step up from ones like even this brand new one. They're not square in this style, and every one of my vintage planes up here in the Bailey styling, not one of them has a square wing. So back in the day they weren't really thought to be used on shooting boards like that, so that it wasn't a consideration that was really taken into it when they machined them, that they had to be dead square. It was just the sole was flat, and that's why most of your vintage ones won't. You might luck out and get one, or you may want to try and correct one, but it's good to see that the machining on the wings of this is good. So before we put this back together and take a shaving and see how well this works, let's do our same straight edge on the sole, and we'll see how flat this is using the feeler gauges. So let's put this back on here like this. So that feeler gauge on that finest one's not getting on that edge. Let's try the middle. It's catching ever so slightly just here. Now that might be because I'm rocking this a little bit. Just trying to keep some pressure on this. So ever so slight, a little teeny bit's getting under there. Right the way all the rest along there, I can't get that to go under. And out on this far edge. Which means that the machining across nearly every part of this is within that tolerance, which I say is actually a very good tolerance. That is better than the tolerance you'll get with sandpaper on a flat reference block, because the sandpaper is way less accurate than such a fine feeler gauge. Got my little angle finder plate off my Tormek, and I just thought we would check that this angle is actually 25 degrees, so this slot up here, right up the top here, is our 25 degrees. And if we put that in there, we can see that that angle is dead on the 25 degrees, as you would expect for a standard blade. And just out of a little bit of interest, let's see what it is on the chip breaker. It seems to be less than 22 degrees, that angle there, which, actually no, it looks like it's dead on about 22 degrees. Which generally I expect to find these at about 25, but the angle doesn't really matter too much on these, as long as it has a sharp edge, which is going to break the chip off, and so we don't get them chipping up underneath it. Now, I'm going to take a few shavings with this after we've reassembled to see how well this works without any work on it, and we will do work on this in the next video. So I've gone ahead and reassembled this. It took a little bit for me to get used to how to get those pins in, because I haven't dealt with a bedrock plane before, but it's not that difficult, and I'll cover that in a video coming up on how we attach the frog on both types of hand planes, so stay tuned for that. So we are taking some little fine shavings, but it's pretty hard going, and it's not working the best. It's kind of leaving a very rough surface here, which means out of the box this blade is not sharp. Now that doesn't surprise me. I didn't expect it to actually be sharp, and you should be sharpening any blade straight out of the box anyway. And at this price point of $190 AUD, I didn't expect that everything would be sharpened perfectly and that it wouldn't require any work. It says minimal work, so I think preparing your chip breaker, sharpening your blade is minimal work for setting one of these planes up out of the box. It seems like straight out of the box we have very good machining on the sole to the sides. It's square. There might be a few little defects in the bottom of these planes, and a few little defects with little bits of paint missing and things like that, which you wouldn't expect with a super premium planes like a Lee Nielsen or a Veritas that are up around $600–700 for something of this size here in Australia. So I think overall, for the price point, the machining is almost dead perfect. We might have to do our blade and our chip breaker just to ensure they mate properly and have flat surfaces, but that appears to be the only work that's going to be required on this plane. And we will obviously flatten this hole to ensure coming up that is correct, but it does seem straight out of the box. The only work that we need to do to make this plane function is maybe work on the blade and the chip breaker a little bit, which is what I would expect, and I would say there is going to be minimal work required. So what we're going to do in the next video is properly set this plane up, sharpen it, set the chip breaker, flatten the sole to ensure that it is actually flat, and put the frog across a diamond stone as well to ensure that that is actually flat, and double check my findings that I got with the feeler gauges here today. So there you have it, folks. That's my quick unboxing and quick overview of the Luban Handplane and all of its parts. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised with what we saw here today. Don't forget to stay tuned for the next video that comes out, which will be the initial setup, sharpening and operation of the Luban Handplane. And then after I've been working it for a while, do stay tuned for a review, which will come out in maybe 3-6 months, something like that. I want to give it a good chance before I give you a decent review on it. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing down below. And while you're down there, please comment below. What did you think of the Luban Handplane? Do you have a Luban Handplane yourself? Is there any differences between my Luban Handplane and maybe the one you received? Just so we can give everyone a good overview of not just the one that I have here, but maybe others that other people have received. Just so we get a general idea of the machining across multiple batches. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Instagram and also on Patreon. And if you'd like to see another great unboxing and overview video such as this, please check out the video up here where I unboxed and overviewed the brand new Stanley Bailey handplane. And also the playlist here of the reviews that I've done on the channel so far. Bye for now.